Welcome to Faith on Tap, and this is a very different episode, so much so that I'm not going to lead the way. We have a very special guest from Dennis's realm, so Dennis is going to take over the initial questions, so go right ahead.
Yes, and we are here today with Pastor Brad Brandon, who is the founder of Across Nigeria, a ministry that goes into northern Nigeria to bring the gospel to the Fulani Muslims. We're excited about this interview. We're going to hear his story, where he's been, where he's going, and what God has done through him. So, Brad.
Hey, that sounds good. Good to be here. Good to be on Faith on Tap. I love the name too, by the way. That's awesome.
I think before we get into the actual ministry, if you can briefly share the story of how you learned to hear God's voice, which led you to that first village.
Yeah, I'll try to be really brief on this because it's a long story, but I'll give you the super condensed elevator pitch. So I was a pastor of a pretty big church in Plainville, Connecticut. And I had been called out here to take over a church for a pastor friend of mine from Minnesota. I was pastoring originally in Minnesota. We had everything we wanted. We were comfortable. Like I had the corner office with windows, good church, and just it was really amazing. And I thought our calling to come out to Connecticut was all about us taking over the church. And what I realized through the process was that the calling to come out to Connecticut had nothing to do with taking over the church and had everything to do with getting me one step closer to going to Africa, where I minister now. And so long story, very short, is I ended up, not long after we took over the church here in Connecticut, I ended up in the hospital for about a month and a half. And I was in the ICU. And during that time, for the first time in my walk with the Lord, I began to hear God speak to me. Now, it wasn't an audible voice, although I don't doubt that some people hear an audible voice. For me, it was exactly the way Paul describes it in Romans chapter 8 when he says, his spirit bears witness with my spirit, meaning that God's spirit was speaking to me through my spirit. And it didn't even need to be an audible voice because that would have almost diminished it. It was so powerful and so strong, and it really challenged my theology. Because my theology at the time didn't allow for me to hear the voice of God. Very strict cessationist, if you're familiar with that at all. We have the Bible. We don't need the Holy Spirit. We don't need anything else. God doesn't speak to us anymore, only through his word. And what I really experienced in the hospital was God's voice speaking to me. And it was almost like he put me in a position where I couldn't go anywhere. It was kind of the reason why God, touched Jacob's thigh. And he kind of solidified him in that place so that he couldn't run. And that was what was happening to me. Was I was planted in this place. I was a shell of a man because of my illness that I was going through, and really all I could do was lay there day in and day out for a month and a half. And it was almost like God put me in that position where I was forced to hear him. And as I began to hear him, I began to learn what he sounds like for the first time. I had been a pastor for 20 years and had never had this experience before. And I love it because it goes right along with what Jesus says. Jesus says, my sheep hear me, they know my voice, and they follow me. How can we follow the Lord's leading if we don't know his voice?
Could I interrupt you just for a second?
Yeah.
What did you find out about how to listen to God?
What I found out about how to listen to God was put yourself in a position where you can hear him, meaning that get rid of all of the external noise and distractions that happens all the time, almost 24 hours a day. We're inundated with distractions, phones, radio, media, TV. Get rid of those and just listen for God. He's always speaking to us. The issue is, are we listening? Or are we distracted by something else? So, and that's a lesson that I take with me even today. When I stop hearing the voice of the Lord leading me in my life, I realized that I've gotten to a place where I've become so distracted by things. And I start to realize I need to put the phone down. I need to turn the TV off. Maybe I need to make this hour-long drive without the radio on.
And so what would be the difference of hearing your own thoughts versus hearing what God?
Yeah, so that's a great question because people always ask me that. They're like, how do I know if it's me or how do I know if it's God? It all goes back to you recognize the voice that you're familiar with. So I give this example. Those of us who are parents, you could have a room full of kids, right? And you wouldn't even have to be in the room. If you could hear those kids talking, 20, 30, 40 kids, and one of your kids were in that room, you would be able to discern the voice of your own child in a second, in a split second. And the reason is because you're so familiar with their voice, you can decipher it from all the other voices, even if everybody else is chattering. And that's kind of how it is with the Lord that I learned, was that there's no formula for determining whether this is God or me or some bad pizza I ate last night. There is no formula. The answer to that question is familiarize yourself with the voice of God, and that takes time. That means you have to invest time, and there's no shortcut for that. There's no program that I can type in, and if I put in this formula, I get the voice of God. It requires you to have an investment in time and take the time to listen for his voice and become familiar with it. Once you become familiar with his voice, then it takes a millisecond to go, that's God. That's God speaking to my spirit. And so that's what I experienced. And I came out of the hospital, praise God, healed, and I went back to my church, and I was never the same again. I had that experience, and I just was not the same person. I pastored different. I read my Bible different. I did devotions different. It was just a whole new walk for me. And I think that was scary for a lot of people that I was ministering to because they were used to this strict cessationist pastor who stuck to those guidelines. And now all of a sudden he's talking about the Holy Spirit and hearing the voice of God and listening and following God. And I think that just scared a lot of people. So during that time, I became a church growth expert. I grew our church from about 200 down to about 30. And
people like that.
and so through the process of that, I ended up in Nigeria. I was supposed to go there to dedicate a church building that we had built, that we had financed, I should say. And
that was in southern Nigeria.
That was in southern Nigeria. That's right. So I was all headed to southern Nigeria. And when I sat down at the computer to buy my ticket, all of a sudden there's that voice again. And that voice said, I do not want you to go to, I would have flown into Lagos. I do not want you to go to Lagos. I want you to go to Abuja. Abuja is the largest city in Nigeria, but it's in the north. And the north is about 95% Muslim. And it's a very dangerous part of the world. But I knew that was God. So I bought a one-way ticket to Abuja, Nigeria. I didn't know anybody. Nobody was supposed to pick me up. I literally was going to land and walk off the plane and go, okay, God, here I am. It sounds crazy, even to me now telling the story. I often think back and I'm like, could I do that again? And I don't think I could. I think I would be scared to do that now. But I love it because God gives us the grace that we need to do what he's called us to do, right? And so he gave me the grace that I needed to do it at that time. And that's what happened. I ended up flying into Abuja, Nigeria. I ended up in a tribe of Fulani Muslims. We started to develop a friendship. And
let me put the brakes on that quickly, because I think part of your story is how you got to that village.
Yeah. Okay. If you want me to tell that part of the story, I can tell the story. So I get off the plane, and it kind of goes back to when I was still in the U.S. before I had left. I had contacted somebody. I was really panicking because I'm like, God, what do you want me to go here to do? Like, I'm literally going into somewhere I have no idea. I don't know anybody. I don't even know where I'm going to sleep when I get there. And so I started kind of reading stuff online, seeing if anything sparked, looking for that hallelujah moment. And it was like, I read an article about IDP camps. IDP camps are internally displaced persons camps. They're horrible places in Nigeria where they basically put people who've been displaced, whether by violence or flooding or fires or whatever. And so I had emailed the guy who wrote that article. He was a Christian guy. He was an attorney, Nigerian, who lived in Washington, D.C. And so I just sent him an email and I said, hey, I'd like to talk to you about this article. Again, I'm just looking for anything to spark. God, what, give me a light. And so he called me within 20 minutes of sending that email. And we had about an hour-long conversation. And I didn't tell him anything about my trip. I was just asking him about the IDP camps. And he said, well, if you ever find yourself in Nigeria, he said, look me up, because I go back to see my family and this, that, and maybe we could get together. I said, well, it's funny you mentioned that, because in about 2 weeks, and I gave him the date, I said, I'm heading back there. And all of a sudden it was like the phone went quiet. And he goes, you're going to Nigeria? Where are you flying into? I said, Abuja. He said, you're flying into Abuja? And I said, yeah. And he said, on this date? I said, yeah. He said, I'm flying in on that day to Abuja. And
awesome.
and I said, he said, what time does your plane land? I said, mine lands at 10 or whatever it was. His landed at 8. I mean, we were literally hours apart from landing in the Abuja airport. And it was kind of like, okay, I think we should probably get together when I get the, and so we ended up getting together, and I'm condensing this story very much, but we end up heading out to an IDP camp. He basically invited me to go out to an IDP camp and kind of experience it. And at this time, I'm still wondering, God, what are we doing? What am I here for? Are we supposed to start churches in IDP camps, minister to people? I don't know. I have no clue. And I just remember God through that process asking me, do you trust me? Do you really trust me? And I guess part of faith on tap, faith requires risk. Right? Mm-hmm. If it's a guarantee, then it's not really faith. And so we went out to this IDP camp, drove out there hours and hours and hours, ended up out there. And we get out and we ministered to some people, pray with some people. We had brought some bags of rice with us and nothing real. I was really expecting to get out of our truck and like this light from heaven would shine down and be like, the hallelujah chorus would start in and like, this is what you're supposed to do. It was really anticlimactic. And I was like, well, I'm lost, God, But I remember on the way in, off in the distance on the horizon, I saw some like grass huts and like cooking fire and stuff going, and it looked very primitive. And I remember asking one of the pastors who had picked up along the way, I said, what is that over there? And he said, oh, those are Fulani Muslims. We don't go anywhere near them. We stay away. They kill thousands of Christians every year. They're extremely violent. We can't go anywhere near there. And I said, good idea. Let's stay away from there. And so anyway, on our way back from the IDP camp, that same Fulani village was now on my right-hand side. And as I was watching them on the horizon, as we were going out of the bush, I heard that voice from the Lord say, you need to go to that village. And I knew it was that voice. Because again, like you asked, how do you know? Are these just my crazy thoughts? Or is that really God? And for me, I had become so familiar with that voice. It was like, that's God. It's the same. It's like the illustration with the kids. Like, that's my kid. I know I can hear you. And so I told everybody in the vehicle, we were in the SUV, I said, we need to go to that village. And they all started laughing at me, like, oh, silly American, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I didn't really. And I said, no, guys, I'm serious. I said, God is telling me I need to go to that village. And I remember one of the guys in the vehicle with us, he said, are we called to grab vipers by the tail? He said, I remember he said that. And I said, no, but we are called to preach the gospel to every creature. And so they said, we're not going. We can't even go. You need an invitation from the chief to even go. And that's not going to happen. So it's impossible. You go anywhere near that village, you'll get killed before you even get there. And I said, okay. I said, listen, guys, you either find a way to get there or I'll find a way myself. I'll call Uber or something, whatever it takes, right? I'll get there. Because I know that's what I'm supposed to do now. Got a call the next morning from one of the pastors who was in the vehicle with us, and he said, I don't know who you know, I don't know who you are, but I got a call. He had known a guy who knows a guy kind of thing, who had some contact with one of the Fulani guys in that village. And he said, I called him, and the chief wants you to come out and meet with them. And I'm like, okay, this, and still at this time, I don't know, are they calling me out there to ambush me? Right? Are they calling me out there to have me for dinner? I don't know what's going on still. And so we got up the morning we were scheduled to meet with them, and we drove all the way out there, hours and hours and hours and hours. And the minute we got out there, it was tense. They were armed. They had machetes. They had AKs, all the typical things you would think that they have. And they were very stoic. They were very serious. So I didn't know why I was even being called out there, really. Here's, this white guy from Minnesota. What do I have in common with these people? But I remember I was about 20 minutes away from the village and I heard that voice again. See, this is why it's so important for us to stop and learn that voice. Learn to listen to the voice and learn to recognize the voice of the Lord, because he will guide you all along the way. And so when we were about 20 minutes away, the Lord spoke to my spirit. That's the only way I describe it. Maybe there's a better way, but the Lord spoke to my spirit and said, love their kids. That's all I got. It's like, okay. So we get out to the village, and again, they were stoic, they were serious. I didn't really know what was going on, but all of a sudden what caught my eye, sort of off out of the corner of my eye, there were a group of children that were sort of peeking around one of the grass huts, and they were looking at me. I stand out in northern Nigeria, and
especially your white shirt.
Yeah, that's
right.
Yeah, my white shirt, my uniform that I wear everywhere, and so I went over to them and I started doing like hand tricks with them, where like you pull your thumb off, and just different things. And they were laughing. Some of them were like, "Oh, that's voodoo." and I pulled out my phone, started taking videos and selfies with all of us. We were just laughing and having a good time. I probably got 30 or 40 pictures, videos, and all of a sudden the chief comes over, Chief Alhaji Gambo. Alhaji means it's a title that's given when you've made the trek to Mecca. So he was legitimate, right? Chief Alhaji Gambo. And he comes over, and in a very gruff voice, and they speak Hausa there. At the time, I didn't speak Hausa. I speak Hausa now, but at this time I didn't. This was 10, 11 years ago. And so he comes over and says, well, what's going on? And he's angry. I could tell by his countenance, his voice. And I pulled my phone out, and I remember my hand was even shaking. And I went to my photos and my videos, and I clicked on one of them. Wasn't the first one, wasn't the last one. It was literally whatever one my finger got to first, just to show them I was just having fun with the kids. And so it was a video. I played the video for him. It was two little girls. They were laughing and giggling and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, his countenance just totally changes. And he starts laughing. I mean, he's like double over laughing. He's calling his elders over. All the elders come over. They start laughing. He's telling me, play it again, play it again, play it again. And my translator came over to me and said, you don't know this, but those two girls in that video are the chief's two granddaughters.
Oh, wow.
And so at that point, I realized I'm not in control. I never was in control, right? Control is an illusion because we never have it anyway, and we always want it. We always try to get it or think we have it. And I realized at that moment that God was even controlling my fingers in my hands on what picture to push and click on. And I just kind of at that point let myself go. And like when Ezekiel threw himself in the river and just let the river take him, that's kind of how I felt. It was like I just threw myself into God and just let God take me wherever he wanted me to go. And so that is, believe it or not, the condensed version of that story.
One question I had, because I think you initially said the chief invited you.
Yes.
How do you know about you?
I don't know to this day. I have no idea. I think what he was told was that an American wants to come see you and meet with you. He was intrigued by that.
Okay.
And so he invited me to come out. I think that's what happened, but I don't know that's what happened.
And you're still good friends.
Oh, and that's a great point. Thank you for that. Chief Alhaji Gambo and I are great friends, even to this day. Lifelong friends. He's a devout Muslim, but he is an amazing man, amazing leader, and we meet often and speak often. In fact, this was probably a year ago when I met with him. His wife had gotten into an accident and she had gotten injured. Her leg was injured. He said, Pastor, please come and pray. I want you to lay hands on my wife and pray for healing for her. Now, for a Muslim to ask a Christian to pray for him is not kosher or approved, right? Kosher is the wrong word. But for a Muslim man to ask another man to touch his wife, even just to lay hands and pray, is absolutely forbidden. But it just shows the trust that has been built over time between Chief Alhaji Gambo and myself. And everywhere I go, I ask people, please pray for Chief Alhaji Gambo that God would open his heart to the gospel of Jesus Christ, because I have no doubt that God is working on his heart. Yeah.
Wow. And so that established the ministry.
That was it. He invited me to speak to his entire village. And this was after we had developed a relationship. And again, we're, condensing it down to movie script. But he asked me to come speak to his entire village community. It was probably 500 men plus women and children. I went and I asked him, I said, what do you want me to say? And he said, you can say anything you want. And I knew that was my moment. And so he invited me. He introduced me to all of the men in his village. I gave my testimony about how I met Christ and how they could do the same thing in their life. And afterward, Chief Alhaji Gambo got up and he said this, I'll never forget it. He said, we've been praying to Allah that Allah would bring us help. Now, over the course of time, we had helped them with water filtration systems, some medication for their children, things like that. We've been praying to Allah for years that Allah would bring us help. He said, here comes this man who not only brings us help, but also brings us this message about Jesus. And he said this to all of his people. He said, who are we to say that Allah did not send this man to bring us this message about Jesus? So basically what he was saying was Allah sent me to tell them about Jesus, which is pretty amazing, I think. But from that, there were 13 Muslims who came to Christ from my testimony in that community. And that's the start of Across Nigeria.
And the chief doesn't have a problem with that.
Well, it's different in different places. These 13 are kind of like Nicodemus by night. If you know what I mean, right? They're kind of underground because he probably would have a problem with that. Yeah. But one of those who got saved was the assistant chief. And I remember it's funny because we were driving, I was discipling him and we were driving in the back of our SUV once. And he said, Pastor, please help me, please. He said, I'm having so much trouble. I said, what's the trouble? He said, I need you to teach me. And I said, teach you to do what? He said, I'm having so much trouble witnessing to all 4 of my wives.
But nothing you can teach.
Right. I know. That's like, they did not teach me that in Bible school. But his sister lived further north in Nigeria, and we ended up helping that village and starting a school there. We started a school in the first village. We have 4 schools now. We use primary schools to teach. We use the Bible, first of all, to teach Muslim students to read and write English. That's what our schools are.
So how did you get the inspiration, or when did God tell you that education was going to be your kind of inroad to these communities?
I really didn't even know. I wish I could say, oh, I had this all planned out. I was so strategic. It really wasn't. I was like flying by the seat of my pants. And so I was just walking down a trail through their village one day as I'm hanging out with them and getting to know the whole village over the course of weeks. And all of a sudden, I looked over at this empty lot of land. I didn't know who owned it. I didn't know if it was for sale. I had no idea. It's just an empty plot in the middle of the sub-Sahara desert, in northern Nigeria. And all of a sudden, there's that voice again. And God says, I want you to build a school on that land. So I gathered up all the elders and I prayed with them, and I said, in Jesus' name, I pray that God would build a school here in this place that would further his kingdom and glorify his name. And there's a school there to this day that has about 450 students, Muslim students who go to school there every day, taught from the Bible to learn to read and write English. Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow. So now you've established this ministry, or you've had these inroads now.
Yeah.
What were the conditions like when you started to explore different villages, engaging in different communities? What were you finding was a constant theme for these people?
The constant theme is that northern Nigeria is the most persecuted place on earth. And what's funny is it's the least talked about. Mm-hmm. Everybody talks about China. Everybody talks about this country, that country, Russia. There is no place on earth that's persecuted like northern Nigeria. And I'm not saying that from a biased perspective. The numbers speak to that. There are more Christians killed in northern Nigeria than anywhere else in the world every year. So if you last year, if you take all the Christians that were killed in the entire world, right, martyred for their faith, 90% of all the Christians martyred in the world were martyred in northern Nigeria. That's the numbers. There were, I think, in 2021, there were 5,191. The next year, there were 5,068. The next year, there were 4,940 something. We don't even know what the numbers are, but they're already coming in for last year, but we won't know until May or June. But the official numbers haven't come in, but it's looking like it's going to come in at about 4,200.
I was going to ask the question later. But when I was doing my research, and I know that I found really interesting that according to World Watch List in 2025, well, first of all, I found out that the predominant religion in Nigeria is Christianity.
It is, yeah.
Which I thought was really surprising.
Most of southern Nigeria is Christian. In fact, I think all of it. The Yoruba and Igbo tribes populate the southern Nigeria, and those were the first ones that the Dutch and British missionaries reached. And Christianity took off among those tribes and has a stronghold there today. But northern Nigeria is entirely different. It's almost a whole different country, really. Yeah.
Now, is that due to the Muslim population being educated or uneducated, or is it the sect that causes the violence?
It is due to a lot of different things. I wish I could say it was just one thing and the problem was really easy and simple to solve. It's not. It's so complex. You have Fulani Muslims. You have Hausa Muslims. You have all kinds of Muslims.
Could you explain the difference between them?
So Hausa is a tribe. And Fulani are actually an ethnic group of people. And I often liken them to like the Native Americans here in the United States. That's the only parallel that I can find a really good illustration for, is it would be like the Fulani would be the Native Americans of West Africa. And they're indigenous to the area. They're very mystique. They even look different. When you look at a Fulani person, they're like olive skin toned. Their facial features are different. They have very long pointed noses. Instead, most Nigerians have wide noses. Just even in their facial features, you can see the difference. They almost look Egyptian, which is interesting. I'm not advocating this, but there is a legend among the Fulani people that they are the descendants of King David and the Queen of the South. They actually think that some of them believe that they're descendants of the Jewish people and that offspring.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is there any cross-pollination between the Huza?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Okay.
Yeah, there is. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's just like, again, it's like the Native Americans here. If you go onto a reservation, probably most of the children or people on that reservation look as European as anyone else does. It's been diminished or diluted over time. Sure. Although I will say that the Fulani people predominantly have that look. Fulani Muslims. The Fulani are, the last number I saw was 99.6% Muslim.
Okay.
So that's how, they're entrenched in Islam. And I'd love to tell you the story about how they even became Muslims, because they weren't always Muslims. That was kind of Christianity's mistake who allowed that to happen. But I don't know how much time we have.
Go for it. Sounds interesting.
Yeah. So the first British and Dutch missionaries who arrived on the shores of Nigeria, they basically worked themselves up from the shores. That's how the South is mostly Christian now, because the Yoruba and Igbo tribes are the southernmost tribes. Once they hit the north and they ran into Fulani Muslims who had a tendency for violence and protecting their families and their land and their culture and all those things. They're herdsmen, so they're nomadic people. They did not adapt to Western education and Western ideals very well. Let's just put it that way.
Was that part of the Sharia law that they followed?
No, they weren't Muslim at this time.
They weren't Muslim.
At this time. We're talking 250 years ago.
Gotcha.
And they weren't Muslim. And so the early missionaries went in, and the southern tribes were farmers, so they were more adapted to Western learning and ideals, right? So they got all of the high positions. When colonialism took over, a lot of the governorships went to Yoruba and Igbo tribes and, all of that. And they got the favorable treatment. They got the hospitals. They got the schools that were all funded by British and Dutch missionaries and all of those things. And the Fulani people are left behind. The early belief of early missionaries was that the Fulani people, because they lived out in the bush and they were nomadic, they really weren't humans. They were actually more like animals than they were people. So they didn't need to be reached with the gospel because they weren't humans. They didn't have a soul. They were kind of like monkeys. Dare I say that?
Wow.
But they were like animals. And so they were neglected from being reached. Now, I think it was a cheap way out. And I don't know. I think it was a mistake. It was a cheap way out to avoid violence on the part of the early missionaries. And so basically they left a void, a vacuum. Well, Islam came in from the north and they were happy to fill that vacuum. And that's exactly how they became Muslims. Yeah. Yeah.
And so prone to violence, being in the Fulani tradition.
Yeah.
Did Islam kind of create more of violence or more of a what am I looking for? More of a myopic view of the world?
It's possible that it did, but for a long time, recorded history tells us that Christians and Fulani Muslims lived side by side in absolute peace for centuries. The Fulani people are being manipulated and used by the political system in Nigeria. And that's really what's caused in the last 20 years the violence to escalate. So they're being divided and they're being weaponized so that to the benefit of other people. Politicians, people who want power, seeking power, will use the Fulani Muslims. On top of that, what we've also experienced in the last 2 or 3 years is that now terrorist groups like Boko Haram and ISWA, which is the Islamic State of West Africa, they're actually using Fulani Muslims to do their dirty work. So they will pay Fulani Muslims to go in and massacre a Christian village. The reason they do that is if Boko Haram goes in, it becomes an international incident because Boko Haram is internationally known. It's watched by the UN, watched by the United States. Even our State Department and our CIA watches Boko Haram and their activities. Whereas if the Fulani go in and wipe out a Christian village, it's just a domestic incident. And it really doesn't get much coverage. So the Boko Haram and ISWA have learned to use the Fulani now to go in and do their bidding, and they're doing it. Yeah. So that's why I say this is very, very complicated. It's not just Christians versus Muslims. There's a lot of dynamics to this. Yeah.
So there's no silver bullet.
Mm-mm.
What if you were to reign over the area, what would you do to change things?
I would give hope and opportunities to the Fulani people. Right now, they have no hope. They have no opportunities. Life is getting worse for them. And the reason why people typically, and this is true throughout history, typically people want to avoid violence. Violence is very costly. It costs ourselves. It costs our future. It costs our posterity. We want to avoid that. We know that it's costly. So the reason why most people revert to violence is because of hopelessness. They feel like they have no other options because nobody's listening. And so I would say, to answer that question, it's not a simple silver bullet,
Sure.
but I would begin to give hope to the Fulani people. And that's what we're trying to do with our schools. Our schools bring in educational opportunities for Fulani Muslims that they would never get, because I think it's 90% of Muslim children, Fulani Muslim children, are not in school.
Well, they're nomadic. So,
Mm-hmm.
so how, I mean, are they like traveling schools as well?
So there's another complicated question. So the Fulani people now are divided into settled, nomadic, and semi-nomadic. So there's 3 types of Fulani Muslims in northern Nigeria. So far, we've targeted the settled Fulani, and that's what our schools cater to. We have buildings, we have teachers that go to work there every day, all of those. And so the children go to those schools, they sit in a classroom. That's how they do it. They're settled.
How related are these 3 different groups?
Oh, they're all the same people. It just depends on.
So they'll
what
have
they're
like
doing.
family members that are
Absolutely.
each
Yep.
of the 3 groups.
Yeah.
So there
Yep.
is, they know what's going on.
They do. So one community would be settled. All the kids would grow up in that community. So we cater to that community that's settled. So all of our schools are in settled Fulani communities. Now, what we are doing this year, one of our initiatives this year, is we are just beginning to break ground on reaching the semi-nomadic and nomadic schools. And so we have met with 6 Fulani communities that are nomadic, and we are working on a cure to this problem. How can we educate nomadic children? And we've been working on this project for about 2 years. We just earlier this year, made steps to actually take initiatives to get things done. And that's one of the things. I'm leaving on Wednesday to go there. One of the big meetings I have are with our 6 nomadic Fulani tribes that we want to get educators in there and start educating them, even though they're nomadic.
And they want their education because it stems back from, you said they want hope. What does education do to give them hope?
Education provides opportunities. So they have opportunities to get jobs. They have opportunities to move somewhere else and get employment. Even just our education is geared very agrarian. So we are teaching them even the ins and outs of how do farmers and herdsmen live together in harmony. Because we were talking about the violence between Christians and Muslims. A lot of the violence between Fulani Muslims and Christians stems from, this is the catalyst. There's an underlying religious aspect to this, but the catalyst is cattle graze onto a farmer's land. The farmer comes out and runs the cattle off. The herdsmen come back and retaliate, and it escalates and it turns into violence and people are killed. That is, I would say, about 90% of that is the start of 90% of the conflict between Fulani Muslims and Christians in northern Nigeria. So what we teach in our schools is, because most of the herdsmen who are out in the field are about 13 years old. So these are kids who have no idea, kids are so myopic, but they're children who are out in the field. They have no idea that when you allow your cattle to graze on a farmer's land, you have destroyed his crop that he's planning to live on for the entire year. And so all of those tensions. So we're dealing with those tensions in our schools. We travel around northern Nigeria and do what we call peace tours. And we go into the areas that have had high conflict, and we meet with leaders of the Fulani Muslims and leaders of the Christian communities. We bring them together and we basically arrange peace agreements between those communities. We've done that 5 times with 5 different communities. So far, all 5 of our agreements are being honored. Even to this day, I'm leaving on Wednesday to head back, and we're on schedule to meet with 20 more over the next coming couple months.
Wow.
Yeah.
So your long range goal would be for what?
Long range goal would really be to get, and I know we see these bumper stickers, and I don't know how you feel about it, but I'm just going to use the word, to get Christians and Muslims to coexist peacefully. And I find that as a benefit. I'm a pastor. I'm a Christian, right? So I believe Christianity is the way, and Christ is the way. And that's what I'm going to teach, and that's what I'm going to preach. But it sure makes it a lot easier when I'm friends with people instead of enemies with them. Right. So if we can get them to be living in peace and coexisting together, it benefits all communities. Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
The area that you minister in, as I was kind of doing a little research, Islamic law or Sharia law, seems to 2 different kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
What is the primary law that you come up against in northern Nigeria?
Well, northern Nigeria is about 10 states are completely run by a very strict form of Sharia law. What I mean by that is it's not the kind of Sharia law that you're going to find in Iraq or, some of these westernized Islamic countries. This is a strict form of Sharia law where if you get caught stealing, they cut your hand off. Mm-hmm. If you get caught doing drugs, they give you 40 lashes. If you're a Christian and if you're a Muslim and you convert to Christianity, that is under that strict form of Sharia law is a crime punishable by death, meaning that your family can kill you or they can hire somebody to kill you. And that happens all the time. So those are the conditions that we work under, is that when we do see somebody get saved, their life is instantaneously in danger.
And so what do you do for those people? Do you do anything for them?
Well, it depends. Sometimes we just get them out and get them to a safer place. If it's really severe, like we've had one woman who we led to the Lord, one of her sons found out about it and put a contract out on his own mother's life. In those serious conditions, we'll go in and take people out of those places and we have a refugee facility where we house at any given time 60 to 80 people, and we help them restart their life. They literally come to us with the clothes on their back. I mean, nothing. If you're a Muslim and you convert to Christianity and you do escape with your life under this strict form of Sharia law, the government will come in and take your house, take your property, take your business, take your car, even take your children, all of those things. So they come to us with what they're carrying, and we help them restart their life. We train them in auto mechanics, carpentry, tailoring. We give them a new trade skill, and eventually the idea is to get them out of our facility because we can't house them forever. So we give them about a year, give or take, depending on the situation, and then we will relocate them to a safer part of the country. Usually it's in the south or in Benin or Cameroon or something like that.
And how do they feel about leaving everything that they've known behind for this new faith that they've come into?
They're joyous about the faith, but you can see the pain in their eyes that it's caused. I know one man who his brother tried to kill him in the middle of the night. He woke up miraculously as his brother was about to stab him with a knife. Right? He woke up out of sleep. He grabbed the knife. It cut his hand. He ended up chasing his brother out of his house. He lost the use of his hand because it cut all of his tendons in his hand.
Oh, my heavens.
So he has no use of his hand now. But through the process of that, this is a man who became a Christian. His wife left him and took all of their kids. I think they had like 6 sons, and none of his sons will talk to him. So
Sad.
they're joyous that they've found faith, but you can tell that it's caused a lot of pain. I know we have one woman, a girl, really, in our refugee facility. She was pregnant at the time that she got saved, and her husband found out about it. She tried to witness to him. He locked her in a room in their house, like a jail cell, until she was ready to give birth to the baby. She gave birth to the baby. They took the baby immediately from her womb after birth and took the baby away. She's never seen the baby, touched the baby, heard the baby, nothing.
Wow.
And she felt like her life was in danger. They were going to kill her, so she escaped and ended up in our refugee facility.
Yeah, there's no legal recourse. There's no law.
No. I had a pastor friend of mine who was killed. We were traveling for 2 weeks in northern Nigeria. Pastor Shaibu, this was back in 2021. And we were doing like just an evangelistic tour through the north. We went back to his house near Kano. We dropped him off. We were scheduled to pick him up the next morning. We went back to pick him up the next morning, and his church was burned to the ground. His house was burned to the ground, and we found him hacked to death in his bed in his house. And there's no recourse to that. That's the way it is in northern Nigeria. There's no cops to call. There's no detectives that are going to show up and investigate. It's not going to happen.
So there's nothing to report.
There's nothing to report.
Wow.
No, we took his body and we brought it to our refugee facility. We went and picked up his wife, because our policy is that if we're traveling like that, you cannot have your family stay at your house. They have to stay somewhere else. And that probably saved their life that night. And so we went and picked her up where she was. We brought her to our refugee facility and we buried him.
How did she receive that news?
So, of course, she was broken about it and destroyed. But the whole time she was praying, God, open the hearts of the men who did this to my husband. Open their hearts.
Amazing.
Yeah, and she's still doing ministry to this day. I stay in close contact with her and her daughter, Victoria. Yeah.
So there's all this violence poised against the Muslim who converts to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
There's the violence of the herdsman and the farmer.
Yeah. There's the violence of Boko Haram. There's the violence of ISWA. There's the violence of random terrorist groups. And
so what does that do for you guys? So for you and your group, are you the only Westerner that travels in your group? And what kind of dangers do you come under and or face?
Everyone else who works for Across Nigeria is Nigerian. I believe in that very strongly, that my job is to create jobs and then work myself out of a job and give it to a Nigerian. So our whole organization, even when I'm here in the States, is run by Nigerians over there. I just basically oversee it, supervise it, do what I can.
Are all of them Christian?
All of them Christian. Yep. And so what that means for me is, as I'm traveling through the north, obviously, like I said, I stand out, and so we get put in difficult situations at times. It's very violent. It's a very violent part of the world. It weighs on you heavy. We can walk into a village and they'll be standing around. A man has been declared guilty. They cut his hand off, and I'm standing there. You have to balance. I don't agree with that. I don't like that. It enrages me inside, but I have to meet I have to meet with the man who ordered that, the chief of the village, and I have to be cordial with him, and I have to be friends with him. I have to play the long game. Right. I'm not there to stop that. I'm there to preach Christ. So whatever I have to do or even ignore to get into a position to where I can preach Christ, I will do that. All things to all men.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And that's not easy. That's not easy when you're riding in the back of the truck thinking about it and laying in your bed at night thinking about that. Yeah. But I'm sorry, I didn't
just describe for us, if you would. Has there ever been a moment where you thought, yeah, this is it, I'm going home?
Yeah, many moments. Give you one example. We were in Sokoto, which is a state in the northwest. We were in the capital city of Gusau, and in Gusau, when we arrived into that city, bandits, which are like gangs, Muslim gangs, we call them bandits, they had taken over the entire city. So we had gotten into the city, but they had taken over or were taking over the city as we were entering it. So we were stuck inside Gusau. And we just prayed together. We had a meeting with somebody. We prayed in their office and prayed and prayed and prayed. And we all felt the Lord telling us to leave the city. So we got in our truck and we headed east, and we drove, and we got through the first checkpoint and we made it, second checkpoint and we made it. And as we were approaching the third checkpoint, I noticed that there were no soldiers there or policemen there, and because they were trying to retake the city. So we get to the checkpoint, and just as we're pulling up to the checkpoint, what you do at the checkpoint is everybody rolls their windows down so people can see in. And so as I'm rolling the window down, I looked over to my left on the other side of the road, kind of like in the ditch. There was a group of bandits. Now, if they see me, I'm like a lottery ticket. So if they can get me, probably what will happen is they'll kidnap me and hold me for ransom and think they're going to get $10 million or something. Our organization has a strict policy. We don't pay ransoms because that endangers everybody who works in our area. So we don't pay ransoms, not even for me. And so I looked over, and it was almost like a God thing. They did not see me. They looked in my direction, but I almost felt like they were looking through me. And so in that moment, there were military trucks that were coming down the road, and they started firing into that crowd of bandits. And of course, that crowd dispersed, and our driver hit the gas, and we went about 110 miles per hour down the road for like the next hour and a half just to get out of there. I was watching the news the next morning, and the news had reported that 250 bandits had been killed in that spot that afternoon that we were leaving. That was one of those times I felt almost for sure it was imminent, something was going to happen. But we got through. And what's really cool is I got a text the next day from a pastor who said, I was praying for you, and what I was praying, I just felt impressed that I should pray that God make you invisible.
No.
And he had no idea what had happened, you know?
Wow.
Yeah.
So with all this violence, how do you keep your safe houses safe? How do you keep your schools safe? If you've got the Bible in the schools that you're using as the textbook to teach these kids how to read and write English, how do you not
I'd
violence
love
over
to
that?
give you the American answer and say, because we have guns, we have so many guns. No, that's not what we do. Well, I'm never armed when I'm there. I don't travel with people who are armed. I think that sends a message. I'm not opposed to guns. I love guns. I'm an American. I have guns. I own guns. I'm not a pacifist by any means in that way, but I think it sends a message if we show up with armed guards. And I don't think that message is in solidarity with what we want, what we want to show. And so we don't. And so how do we keep them safe? I don't know the answer to that. So far, we've had schools near us, Muslim schools. Boko Haram's come in and kidnapped 200 kids out of that school. One school about 30 minutes from one of our schools.
Wow.
It wasn't our school.
Is that to employ them into the military at a young age?
Yeah.
Or?
So what Boko Haram does with kids is they'll re-educate the boys, and then they'll sell. Well, first of all, what they'll do is they'll open an invitation and say, if any parents want to pay a ransom, you can pay to get your kids back. So they make money off of that. But most people can't afford the ransom. You know, literally most Nigerians live on $1 a day.
Wow.
Yeah. Minimum wage, so to speak, is right around $30 a month. So they're asking for $2,500 to get your kid back. So you might as well be asking for $1 million, right? And if the parents who can't pay the ransom, their children, the boys will be re-educated and turned into Boko Haram soldiers, and the girls will be sold into slavery.
Slavery for like indentured servant or sex slavery or what?
Anything you can imagine. Anything somebody wants to pay for.
And again, there's no legal means to put a stop to that?
The Boko Haram and ISWA are better equipped and have more resources than the Nigerian military. I've literally been in the north where I've seen the Nigerian military walk off the job because they said it's a suicide mission. They have better guns, they have better vehicles, they're better equipped than we are. Why would we stay and fight?
Wow. Now, is Boko Haram, is their objective still to overthrow the Nigerian government and make the entire country of Nigeria?
Yeah, I think that what they just want to do is run anything Western out. That's what Boko Haram means in Hausa. Boko Haram basically means anything Western is forbidden. Mm-hmm. So they want to run out schools. They want to run out anything that has a Western influence, Christianity. I think ultimately they'd love to take over all of West Africa. They're spreading into Chad, Niger, Cameroon. Boko Haram is getting bigger. They're growing. They used to, when I first started about 10 or 11 years ago, they used to be pretty relegated to the northeast corner of Nigeria. And now they control the entire, from east to west in the north.
Wow. Even in central, where my understanding is the Christian population, is it more centralized in central northern Nigeria than the west and the east?
They would like to tell you that because Kano is in that area, and Kano loves to be touted as this capital of, tolerance and coexistence, and it's not. Just outside of Kano is where my Pastor Shaibu was killed. So it's not quite what they make it sound like. Yeah.
So is it safe to say that unless you've got boots on the ground, it's really hard to determine actual numbers of what's happening and the real story, because what's reported is skewed in some way?
I think it depends on where you're getting the information from. If you're getting it from the Nigerian government, I would look at that with some skepticism, because the Nigerian government's always trying to spin a narrative. And the narrative is that things are getting better. And this, we've got Kano, that's this capital coexistence and all this. And so they're always going to spin things like they're doing right, because they want to get money from the UN. They want to get money from the United States. They want to get money from the United Way. And the only way they can do that is to have certain numbers and statistics. And so they're always going to spin it that way. But there's other organizations where you can get some pretty reliable information, I think.
And would you like to share those?
Yeah, I mean, even just like watch groups, like Christian watch groups, like Open Doors is a good one if you're looking at persecution numbers. Voice of the Martyrs is another one that tracks Nigeria pretty good. And there's one other one. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's actually a Catholic organization that tracks it, and they do a good job also.
Do the Christian Nigerians in northern Nigeria, do they know they are the most persecuted in the world?
Yeah, it's funny because they don't really. Like when I tell them the numbers and talk to them about it, because everything's so separated. So they're all in their own little communities, and it's not like they have. Some of them have TVs, but it's not like they have regular access to the amount of information that we have, Yeah. So a lot of them don't know that.
Are there other groups that are making Christian inroads here? Or are you kind of the lone wolf out there?
I don't want to say I'm the lone wolf, because there are other people that are working with Fulani and Hausa Muslims, but I don't know of anybody else starting schools. I don't know of any. In about 2 weeks, I'll be next week, I'll be traveling into the northeast of Nigeria, which is where Boko Haram started. And I'm going there to start a church. I don't know of any other Fulani church. It's possible that they exist. I'm not saying they don't. I just don't know of any. So I don't want to say we're the lone people out there doing something nobody else is doing, but let's just put it this way. I've yet to see a white guy in northern. I've yet to run into a Westerner in northern Nigeria. Let's put it that way.
Wow.
In 10 or 11 years. Yeah.
Wow. So in the few minutes we have left, I'd like to take it back to the United States, because you live in the United States as well.
Yeah.
And you obviously see incredible cultural differences. What is your view when you get to the United States and you see the squabbling that's happening with adults, with kids?
Yeah.
What's your initial take when you see that?
So I have to be careful of this because the very thing this is where God tests my patience and grace. The very thing that makes me the most frustrated is the very thing that allows our organization to do what we do. And that's the American church. So we're supported by churches. We're supported by American Christians. I mean, I would say 90% of our funding comes from churches and Christians, Christian business owners, so on and so forth. And yet the thing that I consistently find myself more frustrated with than anything else is the American church, because they are so busy squabbling about nonsense, in my opinion, that they are so busy putting on a show that I think in a lot of ways they've lost touch with what they're truly supposed to be doing. And one of the things that Paul says in Hebrews 13:3, he says, as bound with them. So basically what he's saying there is like, if you see your brother suffering and being persecuted, you should view that as though it's happening to you. Not that it's happening to somebody else over there. No, it's happening to you. How would you respond? What would you do if somebody was doing that to your children, right? And I see the American church largely looks at persecution as though, boy, that's too bad for those people over there. And they've lost the idea as bound with them.
Is it because we've become more like country clubs than we have, and we just want to stay cloistered in our own community?
I think so.
Is that what you'd
I think
attribute
so.
to?
I think what the church has experienced to its own detriment in America anyway is vast prosperity. Vast prosperity, I think, has crippled the church. Yeah. So I have to be careful because I don't want to make any pastors mad. I need to tiptoe through the tithers. And
no, I appreciate your honesty. So now turning it to people who are listening to this podcast, and they're listening to you, and they're saying, you have an amazing walk, you have an amazing story. I don't feel I can go to the mission field. It's not who I am. What would you say to them who are earnestly seeking God?
Everybody has a Nigeria. My Nigeria just happens to be Nigeria. But every single person has a Nigeria, a thing that God is calling them to do. Maybe they're distracted, they're not listening, I don't know. But God is calling them to do that thing. Find it, hear it, listen to that voice, and when you hear that voice, obey it. And God will lead you in a supernatural way and give you all power and open all doors, no matter how impossible you think it is. I have to pinch myself every day because I can't believe I'm part of the organization that I started, because I look at it now and say, God, I can't even believe what you've done with this. All because one day I decided to listen to the voice of God and be obedient. I wish I did that all the time. That just happened to be one day where I did.
You had to end up in a hospital, but
that's true. Yeah, it was hard to get me to that place. But I would say find your Nigeria. It's
awesome.
there. It's there. Everybody's got it.
And when you find your Nigeria, you found your Nigeria. And how many Muslims have found Jesus because of that?
Since we've started, we count, and who knows, maybe there's extended ones or ones that have been led to the Lord indirectly. But directly by our organization, we count over 6,000.
Oh, wow.
That's incredible.
In 10 years. Yeah.
Wow.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
You're saving generations of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not. God is.
God is. Your obedience is allowing God to save generations.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
Okay. If someone wants to get in touch with you, what's their best avenue?
www.acrossnigeria.org.
Okay,
That's
great.
acrossnigeria.org.
And then we will link that in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
And can you use the website to also offer support?
Yeah, the website offers support. You can become a prayer partner. You can become what we call a rope holder, which is basically somebody who prays for our ministry. You can become a prayer partner. We have a newsletter that we send out pretty much every week.
Okay.
And we also have a newsletter that we send out quarterly physically in the mail. Yeah.
Is there other media as well, or?
We're on Facebook.
Okay.
Although I can't remember the name. It's across Nigeria on Facebook. I'm sure it'll come up in a search. And then also Instagram.
Okay, great.
Those are very popular in northern Nigeria. Aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Everybody's on.
We'll link everything in the show notes for those who...
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for having me on,
Yeah,
too. This is awesome.
I'm going to put you on the spot. And would you mind ending in prayer, praying for our podcast audience?
I'd love to,
Thank you.
Father, thank you for this time that we've had here tonight, and just to glorify you. This isn't about me. This isn't about us, God. This is about you. And we praise you and honor you for all that you're doing, all that you've done, your power and your might, Father God, unmatched. You are the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. You are over the entire universe. Your word tells us that by you all things consist. The sun rises and sets. My heart is beating right now. I have breath in my lungs because I consist because of you. And so we give you that glory. Thank you for touching so many lives in northern Nigeria. And I pray for the audience of this podcast, every person who hears this podcast, that you, God, would help them to, number one, become aware that you have a Nigeria for them somewhere doing something, whether it's a Bible study or a prayer group or some ministry in the church that you're calling them to lead. They have a Nigeria. And I ask that you would cause them to become aware of that. And Father, I pray that you'd put them in an environment where they can learn to listen to your voice and hear what you're saying, and then give them the courage, Father, to be obedient to that. Because once those three things come together, boy, all of a sudden something amazing happens and you go to work once we get out of the way. So, Father, I just pray that that would happen for every single person that's listening to this podcast. And we ask this in Jesus' mighty name. Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.
And on that note, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I hope I didn't monopolize everything.
Well, better have. That
Kind
was
of
the
had
goal.
to be that way.
But when you interview someone, that's good.
So I'll edit 90% of you out of this.
Yeah, just have our questions.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you again.
But thank you, Brett.
Yeah, thanks for having me.